Welcome to How Positive Are You, episode 34. I'm Terry Michael in Washington, D.C., joined by my co-host David Crow in Calgary, Alberta. Today, we're very pleased to have Dr. Ruggiero with us from the University of Florence, or Firenze, with the Italians in our audience. Before we introduce Dr. Ruggiero, let me ask David if he has any feedback from our listeners.
Yes, we have 3 different people who wrote to us between the last 2 episodes. A woman named Angelica wrote to us from Chile in Spanish. She says, I regularly read the How Positive Are You blog using Google Translate as I don't speak English. I would like to have the interviews in a written form for this reason. I'm not sure this is possible, although if we get some volunteers to translate the audio into written English so that it could be translated more easily into other languages, we'd certainly consider that. I also watch YouTube videos with Spanish subtitles for this reason. My brother is HIV positive, so it is very important for me to know the truth about HIV. Muchas gracias for what you're doing. Second feedback was on the David Raznick interview. Great interview. It's shocking how many people take medications they know nothing about. The third is from a man named Igor in the Netherlands. I'm a gay male, HIV positive, diagnosed 4 years ago and not on any meds yet, as I have normal CD4 counts. And in the Netherlands, doctors prescribe the retroviral therapies only once these drop below 350. It is just recently that I discovered there is an alternative point of view on HIV/AIDS, and I'm still trying to get over this discovery, which isn't easy as it's overwhelming. Call me biased, but the rethinkers seem very realistic to me. I've also just listened to your show on How Positive Are You, the latest edition with David Raznick. He mentions a paper by Busey, and he asked if I could find him in the paper, which I did do, so hopefully you found that interesting. To conclude my letter, I cannot even express my appreciation for what I have discovered, which is due to all the rethinkers, of course with Duesberg in the first place. A person with such a set of values and priorities, and choosing such a course of action without even the slightest trace of bitterness for his personal career, and I presume financial loss, it's unbelievable. If we were to declare the next saint, I would propose Duesberg, not to diminish all the others, including yourselves. I can imagine how many of your gay fellows have not been very grateful to you for, quote, denying AIDS, unquote. However, I think you are doing a true gay community service. Thank you. So that's our feedback for this week.
Thanks, David. I don't think I've ever been referred to as a possible saint. As a non-theistic humanist, that would be. Probably I'm not a candidate for sainthood, or nor are you.
No, definitely not.
Thanks again. And as our regular listeners know, on How Positive Are You, we feature guests with stories to tell about their experiences with the mysterious retrovirus called HIV and the amorphous disease by definition called AIDS. And we also interview medical, science, and epidemiological experts in the anomalies from the single pathogen theory of AIDS. Today, our guest is in that latter category. Dr. Marco Ruggiero is a board-certified medical doctor and a clinical radiologist. He also holds a PhD in molecular biology. He formerly served as medical officer in the Italian Army and is now a full professor of molecular biology and genetics at the University of Firenze in Italy, where he teaches in the faculties of medicine, sciences, and engineering. I'm going to let him tell us some of the rest of his biography, including his work for both a pharmaceutical company and at the National Institutes of Health Cancer Institute in the U.S. with Dr. Peter Duesberg some time ago, because they're important in understanding how Dr. Ruggiero became interested in studying HIV and AIDS. Welcome to the show, Dr. Ruggiero. May we call you Marco?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate it, and I'm very happy to be here with you. Also, I'm here in Florence, but these are the benefits of the global communication.
Well, we're very pleased that you joined us. Let me begin by asking you, just to establish a timeline here, when did you graduate from university, get your PhD and your MD?
Okay, I graduated as a medical doctor in 1980 when I was 24. I was one of the first of my course. And then I got my PhD in molecular biology when I came back from the United States. I spent about 7 years in the United States, 2 years in North Carolina at Barrows Wellcome, where I first learned about AZT in 1984. And I had the opportunity to publish a paper with Nobel laureate Sir John Vane Then I moved to the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, and this is where I met Professor Duisberg in 1987. Just by a serendipitous change, we were in the same office. When I came back to Italy, I got my PhD in molecular biology, so this is more or less the time frame.
And that was 1987 was the very year that Peter Duisberg published his paper in Cancer, am I correct? Questioning the single pathogen theory.
Yep, exactly. And we were all fascinated by his personality. And as a matter of fact, he gave 2 speeches at the NIH at that time. And there were so many people that the main hall was so crowded that people had to stand and be outside of the door. And he gave 2 seminal speeches, once upon oncogenes and cancer, stating that contrary to all belief, and we were also working on oncogenes, that cancer was not due to single mutations of single oncogenes. And then he gave another speech talking about the origin of AIDS, and even that was kind of a shock for all of us. Please remember that we were working in the same building where Dr. Gallo was working. We were at the 1st floor, and Dr. Gallo was at the 6th floor. And so for all of us it was a shock, but we were all fascinated by him, and that's when I began to become a dissident or a thinker, as you prefer.
Well, before you began your questions, David, just one more clarification here. You worked at Burroughs Wellcome, which I believe is now called GlaxoSmithKline. Is that correct?
I think so, yes. At that time it was a Burroughs Wellcome company in Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. However, I was not working on AZT. I was working on protease inhibitors, but just for a completely different task. We were working on anti-thrombotic drugs. But I got some familiarity with protease inhibitors, and the guys working with AZT were just across the corridor. So we had regular meetings, lab meetings, and so I became acquainted with AZT and HIV in 1984.
And AZT and the protease inhibitors are the 2 classes, AZT being, I believe, classed as a DNA chain terminator, a nucleoside inhibitor. Is that correct? So in any case, you had familiarity with both types of drugs that are questioned today.
Yes, exactly.
David, your questions.
Yes, it sounds like it was when you were working with Peter Duisberg that you started to have the first questions about the HIV/AIDS dogma?
Yes, well, as a matter of fact, I was not working with Peter Duisberg. We shared the office because at that time we were so many in that laboratory of cellular molecular biology. Peter was just visiting from San Francisco because he was a close friend of my former boss, Dr. Stu Aronson. And so we didn't work together because at that time I was very orthodox, at least as far as oncogenes were concerned. So I worked on the other side of the barricade. I was working on oncogenes. And Peter also was working on cancer viruses and viral oncogenesis. And at that time, he wasn't working experimentally on AIDS, but he began to formulate these ideas that HIV could not be the cause of AIDS. And so he shared his opinions with us in the office. I mean, we were working side by side 8 hours a day, so it was inevitable for us to communicate and to share ideas on cancer, on AIDS, and other things too.
We should note that Dr. Robert Gallo at that time, from I guess the early mid-1970s until he came up with this theory that one of the retroviruses he had been studying caused AIDS, he had been trying to link retroviruses to cancer without much success.
Right.
And then, of course, Peter Duisberg was working on the same thing. So that's the timeline for how Gallo began, along with Luc Montagnier at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, was theorizing from the retroviruses they could not make cause cancer, that somehow these retroviruses might be causing AIDS. Go ahead. And David, do you want to continue with that?
Yeah, I was just wondering what were some of the things that eventually made you start to question the connection between HIV and AIDS and other aspects of the dogma?
Well, basically it was the logic behind Peter Duisberg argumentation ideas, because his logic was so stringent, and as it is today, that it cannot be denied. And as a matter of fact, as you correctly said, the HTVL3, as HIV was called before Gallo and Montagnier, they reached an agreement, was the third of a family of retroviruses, HTLV1, that stands for human T-cell leukemia virus 1 and 2, were supposed to cause cancer, but they never proved to be so, and as a matter of fact, as of today, there are no cancers caused by those two viruses. And so Robert Gallo was looking for a virus causing some disease, and this is understandable. If you work on retroviruses, you want to end up with a virus, to find a virus that causes some disease, hopefully to defeat that disease. So when the HTLV3 came out, we all doubted that it causes such a multifaceted syndrome as AIDS. And as a matter of fact, the logic behind Peter Duisberg's reasoning was always convincing, as it is still today. Now today we have experimental approaches demonstrating that it is the immune system deficiency that causes a chronic HIV infection and not vice versa. At that time we didn't have that demonstration, but they didn't have either the other demonstration, the other way around. In other words, there was simply an association between what we call signs of HIV infection and AIDS. The association remains, but in order to establish whether is this a cause and effect relationship, or rather just a simple association type of relationship, then it took about 20-some years. And now we are demonstrating that it is a reverse cause and effect relationship. In other words, it is the immune deficiency that causes chronic HIV infection and not vice versa. By the way, this is the exact meaning of the words of Professor Montagnier, who spoke in the House of Number and in many other occasions.
Let's go right to that specific question of HIV, standing for human immunodeficiency virus, which is what the French and the U.S. governments decided to call it. Both LAV and HTLV3 did not use the words immunodeficient. So let's ask you, do you believe there is a discrete retroviral code that could be called HIV or anything else, or do you give any credibility to the belief that there was never any isolation, and therefore we can't even prove that there was a retrovirus, even if you agree with Dr. Duisberg that it is not pathogenic, that it's a harmless passenger virus? So do you think there is something that we can call HIV, whether or not you believe it's pathogenic?
Okay, well, this is a very difficult question to answer, because first you should define what do you mean with the word existence. This is often the question that the so-called PET group asks. What are the proofs for the existence of HIV? And this is a very intelligent question, but however, it requires that we first define the meaning of the word existence. If you say that HIV has not been properly isolated in terms of electron microscopy or classical microbiology, I tend to agree. However, as a molecular biologist, as Professor Duisberg is, by the way, nowadays we define existence, and this is just a matter of definition, is limited, we agree, but we define existence as the presence of a genetic sequence. You call it genetic code, is not perfectly correct, but anyway, if we understand each other is okay. So if there is a unique genetic code, and in the case of HIV it is an RNA genetic code, it is a string of bases, A, T, C, G, 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 A, T, and so on, then we define that as an existing organism. Now, you could say that that genetic code does not belong to HIV, but maybe it belongs to the host, in this case the human being. And this could very well be, because in our genome we have about 8% of retrovirus-like sequences. But as a matter of fact, the human genome has been recently decoded. That happened about 2 years ago. It wasn't in the year 2000, as they say. It was just 2 years ago when Craig Venter published the human diploid genome, that, by the way, was his own genome. So we know now the exact sequence of the human genome from the first base, A, T, C, G, and so on, for about 3 billion base pairs. And as far as I know, but I could be wrong, and if I am wrong, I'm ready to accept it, As far as I know, there is no such a sequence as the one from HIV in the human genome. So this wouldn't be surprising. Retroviruses, they do exist. Professor Karim Allen says there are 80,000 retroviruses or so. So retroviruses exist, and if HIV exists, it wouldn't be any wonder. The point is its name a correct one? Well, I don't know. I don't think so. But nowadays, if we want to understand each other, we have to call it HIV. I think that Professor Montagnier was very, very honest, as he always been, in calling it LAV, that stands for lymphadenopathy, which is a swelling of lymph nodes, associated virus. This is correct. He found a virus that was associated with a swelling of lymph nodes, not even with AIDS, because the patient was just at risk of developing AIDS. So, to answer your question in very simple terms, yes, I do think that HIV exists as a virus, is one of the retroviruses, because its genome has been sequenced, its genome is unique, is not present in the human genome, and I think that it is not pathogenic. In this, I perfectly agree 100% with Professor Duisberg, and I have no difficulty in admitting that the virus existed. There are 80,000, so one more or one less. The point is that, according to my opinion, according to our experience, it is not the cause of AIDS.
So let me just here interject this quick definition. If a virus or retrovirus comes from outside the body, is not part of the human genome, it will be an exogenous virus. If it is part of the human genome, it will be an endogenous virus. So you believe then that it's an exogenous virus?
Well, you see, I don't want here to give a lecture of molecular biology or microbiology because I don't think this is the right time, but also this is a question difficult to be answered because every retrovirus, by its own nature, once infects a host, in this case a human, it copies, translates its own genome into the host genome. So if I am infected by any retrovirus, one moment later, their genome will be into my genome. So it's a question that has a little sense. In other words, HIV, just like any other retrovirus, by its own nature, retrovirus stands for having the ability to copy its own RNA into our own DNA. I hope this is not too difficult. So, yes, they are both part of the genome of the host that they infect, and also they are exogenous because definitely viruses, they move from one host to the other, and retroviruses, they do this. So I don't think it's very important, unless we are philosophers, to distinguish, to make such a distinction. The point is, does HIV cause AIDS? According to Professor Duisberg and myself, no, it doesn't.
I do have one more question, because if a virus was exogenous, then it should enter the body packaged in a protein shell, and there should be virions or virus particles around. So if we accept that the genome is not found in the human genome, and if we also don't have evidence for the particles, are we possibly missing a third possibility such that the genome can be created within the body, not part of the human genome, not exogenous, but created through perhaps some disease process or something like that? Is that possible?
Not to my knowledge, and even though I'm not a virologist, I don't think that this is possible, or at least that this mechanism has never been observed for any other virus. What I think then, what happens with many, many viruses is that if the virus integrates, as we say, in the host genome and then remains there without harming the host too much, it can stay even forever, and who cares? It doesn't cause any harm to the cells. And even if when it reproduces, when it duplicates, you don't see viral particles, as we don't see them, that's true. But also, it is also because we are not looking for them, by the way. Then this would be a behavior quite similar to many, many, many other retroviruses, or as a matter of fact, most retroviruses, if not all of them, are non-pathogenic. DNA virus or RNA virus, but not retrovirus, they are highly pathogenic, and I'm not discussing this. They exist and they're highly pathogenic.
In that regard, let's define, you use the term infect. Infect doesn't necessarily mean it's a pathogen. It simply means it can read the code into the human DNA and be a harmless passenger.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, this is exactly what I mean.
We normally don't try to see the genome directly. There's, of course, the viral load tests. But let's talk about the antibody test. Do you think that antibody tests are reliable indicators of the presence of a genome in the body?
Not at all. Antibody tests are much less accurate than to determine the so-called viral load. The viral load is not accurate because it overestimates by 10,000 times or 60,000 times the presence of the viral genome. So you might have a viral load of, let's say, 60,000, and that means just one viral genome. But antibodies are much even worse because there are cross-reactions, and these are well known, well assessed. And so just to find the presence of antibodies, to be HIV positive, it could mean that you have encountered, that you have met the virus, but there are at least, 50 or 60 other conditions that in the absence of any encounter with the HIV virus, you will end up being HIV positive. So antibodies are definitely very, very little reliable.
And you said that the viral load test overestimates the amount of the virus. You don't think it's pathogenic. Are you aware? One thing I've never been able to find is surveys of the antibody negative population looking for viral load. Are you aware of any such surveys?
No, I'm not aware, and of course this is what is called a tautology, because if you are HIV negative, you do not undergo a viral load test
Right.
by definition. So we don't know. This is a study that could be done, but I'm not aware of any study in this sense. Whereas there are many studies on CD4s in the absence of HIV, and we see that there are many conditions that decrease the CD4s. I'm not aware of studies of viral loads in the absence of antibodies for HIV.
Yeah, it seems to me that would be very important, because if it was determined that, say, 5% of the healthy HIV antibody negative population had a detectable viral load, you'd have to ask some pretty tough questions about what's wrong here. Are the antibody tests wrong? Are the viral load tests wrong? Or are they both wrong?
Well, probably they're both wrong in the sense that no test by definition can be 100% specific and at the same time have 100% sensitivity. But between the two, maybe I am biased because I'm a molecular biologist, but between the two I tend to regard the PCR-based test, like the viral load, more reliable than the antibody test. At least, even so, and Professor Karim Mallis, who is the discoverer, the inventor of the PCR, is the first one to doubt on the pathogenicity of HIV, because he knows, as he used to say in the old days, that PCR amplifies even water. That means that when you amplify by 1 billion or 10 billion times DNA or RNA, eventually you introduce errors, and so in the end you're not always sure what you amplifying. And then even that is quite arbitrary, because lay people think that is amplification of the virus. This is not true. Is amplification of one small part of the viral genome that is surrounded by nucleotide sequences that are called primers, and those are extremely arbitrary. So you choose which sequences you want to amplify, and so this is arbitrary, and therefore it introduces even another variable.
Let's this one bit of clarification here. So you can have a retrovirus infecting a human being, producing antibodies, and that retrovirus still is not pathogenic. Those conditions could all be present, correct?
Yes, yes. And this is, by the way, the rule for the majority of retroviruses. Most retroviruses, they do like this. We are infected by thousands of retroviruses in every single moment, in this moment here in Florence or in New York City, and those retroviruses, they copy their RNA into our cDNA, but we are not suffering any disease because of those. So you are perfectly correct, and this is extremely common. This is the rule.
And that's what Duisberg means by it is a harmless passenger virus. It just sort of hitches a ride on our DNA, but doesn't cause any disease. David.
Exactly.
Yes. So let's move on to AIDS drugs. I wasn't aware that you had worked with protease inhibitors. What is your opinion about the drugs that are used for AIDS, particularly the nucleoside analog family and the protease inhibitor family?
Well, I think that my opinion is useless. I think that the opinion of the FDA and the U.S. government is more important than mine, and it reads quite clearly. It is written in plain English or in plain Spanish, if you prefer. This medicine does not cure or prevent HIV infection or AIDS, and does not decrease the possibility to transmit to other people. These exact words are written for AZT, for nevirapine, for all the combination antiretroviral drugs. And so it is kind of a funny disclaimer, because the FDA it clearly states that those drugs, they do not cure HIV infection or AIDS, and they write these in plain letters. So just go to the FDA website or the U.S. government drug information website, and you will find those words. And so it is quite clear that they do not cure any disease, but it is also clear that as with any other drug, they have very severe side effects. And we remember that they were first developed as cancer chemotherapeutic drugs, and they have very heavy side effects. They cause a fatal multi-organ failure, liver failure, bone marrow failure, kidney failure. And so you have here drugs that are not supposed to cure the disease for which they are prescribed, but they do have toxic side effects. We all know that about 2 years ago, the state of California listed AZT among chemicals known to the state to cause cancer. So I think it's quite simple. Here you have a drug that does not cure the disease for which it is prescribed, that it has very heavy and toxic side effects, then you choose.
Let me ask you this then. Let's say you have a disease in your body. Let's say you have some bacteria from a pneumonia kind of bacteria, or let's say you have a fungal infection. Would these drugs attack those bacteria, those fungi, as well as attacking healthy cells?
Yes, probably they will. I mean, these studies have not been pushed in detail, but all these drugs, they are very strong antimicrobial or antibacterial or antifungine drugs, because these drugs, they work on the basic mechanism of cell metabolism and cell duplication. They don't make a big difference between an eukaryotic cell or a eukaryotic are our cells, or a bacterial cell, because they just block the replication of DNA. And so they're powerful antimicrobial. And therefore, it is no wonder that if you have a severe pneumonia from fungi or from bacteria, those drugs will help. But as a matter of fact, if you have a pneumonia and you take a powerful chemotherapeutic agent used against cancer, that also will help. The point is that it has enormous side effects. So if I have a pneumonia, I prefer to take a regular antibiotic rather than an anti-tumor drug.
So what we're doing with these nucleoside inhibitors, what we're doing with these protease inhibitors, we're in effect trying to kill a bug with a nuclear weapon, whereas we have other weapons to use against those bugs. Is that not correct?
Yes, this is correct. And as a matter of fact, a friend of ours, Dr. Klaus Köhnlein, who is a bona fide rethinker or dissident, he is not ashamed to say that sometimes he used those antiretroviral drugs to cure extensive fungal pneumonia. And this is not because he became an heretic rethinker, but simply because those drugs, in some cases, they work. They are called antiretrovirals because they were studied in that respect, but as a matter of fact, they are antimicrobial. And, they are just part of the tools of the drugs that a physician has to fight this or that infectious disease. They are very difficult to handle because they have powerful side effects, and definitely it is very risky to take them for all your life, especially in the absence of symptoms.
Yes, one thing I wanted to mention, I like to quote this, one of the most astonishing things in the Retrovir product monograph, and Retrovir is another name for AZT, it was often difficult to distinguish adverse events possibly associated with administration of Retrovir, AZT, from underlying signs of HIV disease or intercurrent illnesses. So the manufacturer themselves not only says that it can't cure AIDS, but it can actually cause the symptoms of AIDS.
In summary, then, what we have here is a non-pathogenic retrovirus being attacked almost nuclear weapon fashion by drugs that have incredibly adverse effects on the human body that then produce symptoms that you could call immune deficiency symptoms. In other words, it's what Peter Duisberg said, it's AIDS by prescription, correct?
Yes, I tend to agree, and in general terms, there are instances where this kind of drugs like, arsenium or cyanide can be useful, but most of the times they are poisons.
I'd like to move on to an interesting paper that you wrote, and there's two aspects about this paper that are interesting. First, the title, AIDS Denialism at the Ministry of Health, and this is the Italian Ministry of Health. And the second is the circumstances surrounding the publication and subsequent withdrawal of the paper. But maybe we can first start by having you explain, what do you mean by AIDS denialism at the Italian Ministry of Health?
Well, that was a very provocative title that actually succeeded in its goal because it had the editor-in-chief fired and the paper withdrawn and a clamor for about 1 year about this paper. So if I wish to be provocative, I succeeded. And I meant that looking into the details of the rules and regulations of the Italian Ministry of Health about HIV and AIDS, you end up thinking that they doubt that HIV is the cause of AIDS. Because, for example, you find written that AIDS can be diagnosed in the absence of any type of sign of HIV infection. And this would be the end of it, because if you can diagnose a disease in the absence of its putative, etiologic, or causative agent, this automatically implies that that is not the causative agent. And so on. And for example, AIDS is not listed among relevant or epidemiologically important diseases. And there is not as yet a registry of new HIV infection, as if nobody was interested in HIV infections, whereas there is a registry of AIDS cases. So there were so many incoherent or inconsistent things in the laws and regulations that made us thinking that either they were not 100% convinced about this, or maybe they made so many mistakes that we had to point them out. For example, if you go, and if you still go, because that was about 2 years ago, but they did not amend, they did not change that web page. Let's say you are a young guy, a young layman, you don't know anything about HIV or AIDS, as my kids do. They don't. And you go to the web page of the Ministry of Health. And so you have a web page entitled To Know HIV and AIDS. So you expect that somebody tells you which is the cause of AIDS. Then you find a description, simple but accurate, of HIV. You find a description of how HIV is transmitted, and that's simple and accurate. Then you find a description of AIDS. Nowhere in that page you will ever find those words. AIDS, it is caused by HIV, or vice versa. HIV is the cause of AIDS. So they describe the two things, implying, but you're not supposed to imply anything, implying that one is the cause of the other, and you don't know which is the cause of what. So as of today, they have, let's say, a very cautious approach maybe because they want to avoid the nocebo effect, and if they do this, they are right, or maybe because they are not 100% convinced of the dogma. Whatever the case, if you look at the rules and regulations of the Ministry of Health with the eyes of a Danielist or a dissident, you find that it appears that they agree with you.
Your view here almost is something akin to heresy in the mainstream HIV equals AIDS community. In the United States, people like Peter Duesberg were shunned by his colleagues for his heresy, his almost Galileo-style heresy. In Italy, in the scientific community, in the molecular biology community, are you shunned for giving this alternative view?
Not at all. Not at all, for 2 or 3 reasons. And the main reason probably is that AIDS is no problem in Italy. You know, I live in this beautiful country of Tuscany, where Florence is located. There are 4 million people, which is almost like many other states in the world. And out of 4 million people, about 2 years ago, the latest statistics told us that 2 people died of AIDS per year of diagnosis, and the year before 7 people. So you see, many more people die just crossing the street. So it is a known problem, AIDS, for most parts of Italy, and unfortunately, regrettably, it is limited, as it was 25 years ago, to the so-called risk groups, that is, drug addicts, intravenous drug addicts, and some subgroups of male homosexuals. So, first of all, there is not such an interest about AIDS. Therefore, I'm not saying that we are discussing about the sex of angels, which is an Italian way of saying something completely useless, but I don't know if you have a similar saying, but anyway, there is not such a hype about AIDS or HIV. For example, there is never any advertisement about the use of condoms. And this is not because of the Pope or the Catholic Church, simply because there is no market. So nowhere in the TV or in the Internet, young guys are exposed to these advertisements about safe sex or using condoms. And as a matter of fact, they don't practice safe sex at all. And I can tell you this by experience, having looked at my 2 kids, by the way.
Italian television, like a lot of European television, is kind of notorious for its sexuality. There's lots of scantily clad women, or if they're even clad at all, much more so than in North America.
Well, not only that, but your prime minister is a little bit notorious for his sexuality.
Well, you know, I've not been shunned for saying that HIV is not the cause of AIDS, and I don't want to be shunned for other reasons too, okay? So I won't comment on this last thing. But anyway,
we will not get into the prime minister, right?
We are very lucky to have a very free sexuality, and all TVs, both public and private, they sport young women and young men also, almost naked, and okay, that's true, perfectly true, and we enjoy it, and I wouldn't change for more regenerate customs.
And our puritanical American and Canadian attitudes towards sex are probably at the root of why in the United States and Canada we still promote this idea that this dangerous sexually transmitted theoretical retrovirus is going to end up in death. Sex and death, if you think about human beings, 2 of the things that really, with which we are in our self-awareness, we're always thinking about, sex and death would come up pretty high on the list. And I think as somebody as a gay man in Washington, D.C., who has watched this unfold for over 3 decades, I think part of the problem here is our puritanical view about sex. And we were able to somehow put together both the left and the right in America here to attack this evil theoretical pathogen as a way of attacking sexuality, almost.
Well, I think so. I tend to agree, even so I'm not so much accustomed with the American habits. But anyway, just to give you an example, we had a recent survey of teenager behavior here in the region of Tuscany. This survey was very well conducted, and we shall present those data at the next conference on AIDS and retroviruses. And so this survey told us that all teenagers have had sex during their teenage years, and that a significant percentage of female teenagers declare to have had more than 3 sexual partners. So I call this promiscuity, because if you are a teenager and you begin your sexual activity at the age of 12, and by the age of 18 you already have had 3 sexual partners, I think this is a pretty good score. But the important thing is that among female teenagers who declared to have had more than 3 sexual partners, the majority did not use condoms, for the very simple reason that having decided to have sex, they took the pill, very simply. And so they did not use condoms. So here we have a risky sexual behavior according to your standards, because many partners are very young, no condoms, and as a result, no AIDS. AIDS is almost non-existent among teenagers, and the mean age for AIDS is about 44 or 45. So since not even the most orthodox will envisage a 35 or 30 years lag between infection and the appearance of AIDS, simply those numbers, they don't fit. Because here, teenagers, they have a very strong and promiscuous and risky sexual activity. And as a matter of fact, sexually transmitted diseases are high, are rampant, because other diseases, they are true. But nevertheless, there is no AIDS among teenagers.
Are you talking about heterosexual teenagers as opposed to gay teenagers?
Yes, the survey was conducted among heterosexual teenagers. I'm not aware of a survey about homosexual teenagers.
And that brings up a good question. How can a retrovirus possibly figure out whether you're gay or you're straight?
Well, it doesn't, of course. I mean, the answer to this question is very simple. The retrovirus doesn't know anything about your sexual attitude, and if it is sexually transmitted, and it is not, because we are all aware of all the studies on the serodiscordant couples. Here we have people who are seropositive, HIV positive for 20 years without knowing it, or maybe knowing it, and practicing unprotected sex with their partners, both heterosexual or homosexual, doesn't make any difference, and the partner remains always HIV negative. So there are so many studies, so many examples from daily life that it's useless to quote them.
I was just trying to be provocative there, because obviously the virus can't tell sexual orientation any more than a virus can tell whether you're African or whether you're Caucasian, whether you're white or whether you're black. But the risk groups continue to be gay males and intravenous drug users. We've never had a heterosexual epidemic of AIDS in the United States or in Western Europe, yet we claim there is a heterosexual epidemic of AIDS in Africa. Sounds like racism and homophobia to me.
I have a question regarding I know that IV drug use is a significant problem in Italy. I know in many places female drug users turn to prostitution, and I guess some males as well, because you have limited career opportunities if you're addicted to, say, heroin or something. Is that true in Italy, that many female drug users would be prostitutes?
Yes, regrettably, yes, that's true. And I don't know which is the cause or which is the effect, whether you become a drug addict because you're a prostitute, but most of the times it's the other way around. That is, in order to collect money to do your drugs, they prostitute themselves. So regrettably, this is very true. And most prostitutes are also drug addicts, and you can see them from the signs in their arms.
Right.
And this is a very ugly thing, but it is true.
So they should, if it was sexually transmitted, just like in America, prostitutes they should be a risk group, and secondly, they should be driving HIV and AIDS into the general population at relatively high levels, starting with the men who use their services, and that's not happening.
No, not at all. And we could make many jokes, as we did before, about this, but all our politicians are in perfect good health, and yes, in Italy, as all over Europe, I think, but I know the data about Italy. I'm sure about those data. AIDS is still confined to the two risk groups. Let's say that the ratio is 1 out of 100,000 in a heterosexual population, 10 out of 100,000 in a homosexual population, and 500 out of 100,000 in the IVU, the intravenous drug users. So here in Italy, most AIDS cases, they belong to the category of intravenous drug users. And female AIDS cases also belong to that category, regardless of whether they're prostitutes or good wives.
And this is a good time to introduce the whole thought about, okay, if a mysterious retrovirus does not cause an immune deficiency syndrome, what was causing the immune deficiency syndrome? And we've already touched on it. We've talked about use of toxins, legal and illegal drugs. We've talked about the spreading of old pathogens, bacteria, fungi, parasites, in an incestuously urbanized gay culture in America. Isn't as simple as that. We simply have a multifactorial explanation for what causes immune deficiency, as opposed to a mysterious retrovirus.
Okay. Well, I try to answer with an example. I think that we all agree to some extent that smoking, cigarette smoking, causes cancer, lung cancer. And as a matter of fact, this is what is written, at least here in Italy, on the cigarette packs. At the end of the year, in Italy, every year, 26,000 people die of lung cancer. 22,000 of them were heavy smokers. 4,000 were non-smokers, not even exposed to passive smoking, not living in polluted areas. So if I ask you, what is the cause of lung cancer? And you answer, it is a cigarette smoking, you are right. But then you go and tell to those 4,000 people who die every year that they never smoke, and nevertheless they got lung cancer. The point is that cancer occurs, and smoking increases the probability that cancer occurs, but not smoking does not decrease the probability to zero. So I could answer the same way. The immune system is a very complicated one. And drugs, heavy drugs, of course, they destroy it. And so in that case, it is easy to see or to say which was the cause for immunodeficiency. Just like in the heavy smoker, it was easy to demonstrate or to say that his lung cancer was due to heavy smoking. But for the non-smoker, just like for the regular girl who has never had two promiscuous sex and nevertheless she has AIDS, the answer simply is we don't know, because biological processes, they are not perfect, they cannot be perfect, and sometimes complex systems, just like the immune system or just like the DNA mutation in cancer, they go wrong. And so the immune system can go wrong for a variety of reasons. We know some of them. We know about poppers, we know about strange sexual habits, we know about drugs, but there are many more causes that we don't know and we will never know, that nevertheless will impair the immune system. Just like we don't know why do 4,000 people die every year of lung cancer even though they never smoked. And the answer is simply because cancer occurs and immune deficiency occurs, period. We have to accept that we shall never know all the causes and effects of all diseases. And this is true for most diseases. It is not only limited to AIDS, by the way.
Another thing we can take from that example, I mean, the massive number of lung cancer cases compared to the tiny number of AIDS cases in Italy. I'd like to turn, if we could, to another aspect of the paper. It was accepted for publication. AIDS denialism at the Ministry of Health was accepted for publication in the journal Medical Hypotheses in 2009, and it was posted on the website. But then it was withdrawn. So can you tell us about what happened?
Okay, well, some parts of the stories, they are known. Other parts are just inferred. But as a matter of fact, we published that paper in, I think, July 2009. And Peter Duisberg congratulated with us for this success. And then he also published a paper in Medical Hypothesis where he questioned the numbers of deaths attributed to HIV or AIDS in South Africa in particular and in Uganda. And our paper was posted, actually it was published, and it was posted as in press, but with a full paper visible for about 1 month or so. Then, after the publication of Peter Duisberg's paper in Medical Hypothesis, I think that some opponents of our view, they wrote a letter, and actually Nobel laureate Professor Barré-Sinoussi wrote a letter to the Elsevier, not to the editor of Medical Hypothesis, who was didn't know anything about this, but to the main, the big bosses of Elsevier, that is the publisher, and asking to withdraw both papers because they were Danielist and they caused a great danger to global health. They were a threat to global health and potentially libellous. And because of this, the big bosses of Elsevier, of course, Elsevier is a profit company. They want to make money. They don't want to pursue the truth or to pursue the scientific truth. They have had several scams in the past, and these are well known. And so they withdrew the paper. A very, very long, months-long investigation went on, and eventually they decided to withdraw the paper for good. They fired the editor-in-chief, Professor Bruce Charlton, an extraordinary person, truly an exquisite gentleman, a great scientist, who, since he didn't want to renounce, he didn't want to change his mind about those papers and the direction of Medical Hypothesis in general. He was not forced to resign. He was fired, brutally fired, and we have to laud his consistency. And so this is the way it went. In the end, nothing changed because we published that paper just a few months later in an extremely respected journal, which is the official journal of the Italian Society of Anatomy and Histology. So it is actually much more important than Medical Hypothesis, because Medical Hypothesis is just a commercial publisher, whereas we were able to publish it in the official journal of one of the most prestigious scientific societies of this country. It is also internationally recognized. So, and now it is listed in PubMed. It was a peer-reviewed journal. And so, in the end, nothing changed, but there was such a clamor that maybe if they didn't say anything, it went unnoticed. Nobody would have noticed that paper if they didn't make such a clamor. So it backfired.
For our listeners here, we need to explain that what we're talking about here is a peer-reviewed journal, a journal publishing something from people with expertise, then that being withdrawn because other people claiming expertise used political means to try to stop the publication. Sort of the antithesis of what sciences ought to be about, in which there should be an effort to think and rethink constantly ideas by people who have expertise. But in this case, you had one set of people claiming to be experts trying to stop another group of people from presenting their ideas to their colleagues.
Right. Marco referenced other scandals at Elsevier. I came across one of these on the web. Merck and Elsevier created a journal called the Australasian Journal of Bone and Joint Medicine. Sounds very scientific, but the purpose of this journal was to publish articles that would make Merck products look good. And of course, when this came out, it backfired when everybody realized that it was just a marketing venue. But it's pretty ironic that for Elsevier to claim that they're somehow ethical in removing papers that they think are dangerous to public health when they seem to be for hire by drug companies. And in fact, maybe the fact that they're so closely related to the drug companies is one of the reasons why they felt the need to withdraw the papers.
Well, this could very well be, and that's their problem. It's not our problem, because we have our paper published in this prestigious, peer-reviewed, PubMed indexed official journal of the prestigious scientific society, so we don't care about their commercial problems. Our paper is there, everybody can read it, and the information has been disseminated. So we won't publish any longer with Elsevier, that's for sure. And as a matter of fact, now we publish with German publishers that are much more open-minded than U.S.-based publisher. Even so, Elsevier, I don't know whether it is based in the U.S. or U.K.
I think UK is just a branch. It's the 51st state, I think. It seems to be very, very close to the United States in every way, whether it comes to wars in the Middle East or medicine. There's an extraordinarily close relationship between those two countries.
As we move near the end of our hour, let me ask you, Marco, the difference between scientific research in the United States and in Italy. Here we have a problem of the government funding research and almost demanding that anybody who gets a grant agree with the people handing out the money. We also have the problem of drug companies funding research. What kind of climate do you have in Italy with regard to scientific research that gets away from these problems of drug companies and governments determining outcomes?
Well, we could joke a lot about this, and as a matter of fact, since we have little money, we don't have companies, and the government is busy with completely different things, then nobody cares, as a matter of fact, and we have total freedom. If I wanted to boast all the virtues of Italians, I could say that this is because of the degree of freedom or liberty that we enjoy, but to be quite sincere is that nobody cares, as a matter of fact. So we don't have big companies, not even small companies. We don't have pharmaceutical companies at all. The government doesn't care at all about research, and this is a big problem because there is no funding for research. We have to find money wherever, sometimes begging money or things like that, begging for money. And so because of this, we don't have those problems at all. And so this might sound as a paradox, but since the government doesn't care about research at all, not only our research, research in general, we are completely free. We can do whatever we like. We have a limited amount of money, but we are free to spend it on whatever projects or research or publications that we wish. So it is simply a lack of a perspective of our government, and not this particular government, but for 20 or 30 years. And as a matter of fact, among industrialized countries, Italy is one with the lowest percentage of their gross internal product dedicated to research. And, as a byproduct, maybe this is the only good thing of this miserable state of affairs, as a byproduct is that we have a total freedom of research. Yeah. So I don't know how you want to interpret this. Sometimes we are very pessimistic. Nobody cares about our research because nobody cares about research in general in Italy.
Let me say to you as we conclude here that President Dwight David Eisenhower in his farewell address in 1961 brought up this very problem. He talked about the possible tyranny of over science from government grants. So you may not be well funded, but you do enjoy the academic freedom that a lot of people who are seeking grants in the United States don't have, and who are part of this directed research that has to comport with what the National Institutes of Health believes is truth, as opposed to the truth that you find on your own campuses. David, do you have any last concluding question or thoughts?
No, I think this has been very good to understand your unique perspective on the whole HIV/AIDS dogma, and it's been very interesting to talk about your experiences and some of the aspects specific to Italy. A recent podcast, we talked to Maria Gonzalez in Peru and got a little bit of a feeling of what's going on in Latin America. So it is interesting to get the geographical perspective as well as your interesting personal history and research. So thank you very much for being on our show today.
And Marco, thank you. It has been a pleasure for me to be with you.
And let me add, thank you, Marco, for your leadership in being able to offer some truth here in an area of scientific inquiry where many people just simply don't want to hear any contradiction of their truth. So we appreciate the fact that you are a truth seeker at the University of Florence.
Thank you. I really appreciate your work.
Okay, thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you, David. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.